bunch of people in the morning, and a bunch of people in the evening, or some people. And so that, and then one day after it's
That's a great point, because I think you're absolutely right, the pattern varies greatly.
oh, good, yeah.
And that's the big issue with food service too.
Yeah.
Because you get these peaks, right? These
Right,
spikes.
right.
And there's a huge shortage right now. They can't hire food workers.
Yeah, well, that's working its way out. Because what happens is that you look at keeping it effective, it's a lot of money into relatively poor people. And they're spending it on.
Oh, I see. So you're saying
Video, when you compare a certain time, like even if it blows stuff like that, it doesn't look like people can't see it close up.
Oh yeah, and maybe we subsidize that for a long distance.
So here, yeah, if you think about it, you got to talk to my friend Jonathan Hall, who is the chief economist for
Oh,
PhD economist. If he wasn't working on my team, he was going to kind of get to talk to your group or whatever.
well, so did Mike tell you much about what this is? This new
Various things, acronyms. There's a new set of acronyms.
By the way, would you like a coffee?
I'll take some water.
Okay.
You're talking about it.
No, come on, I'll get you a proper water. Actually, okay, one thing too, yeah.
There's not,
But it wasn't quite the magic bullet that we used.
well, here, the thing in your application, you could turn things over if you see the clear indication.
Exactly, yeah. Or even just RFID tags could be a good.
Yeah, RFID.
But actually, no one's even a better for me. There's something that's called Digimark. And It's very simple. You've probably heard of it. all it is barcodes, but that are printed with a kind of invisible ink, and they're all over the top.
Oh, okay.
It's a really good idea. And
So you don't have to change those up?
no, it's on all sides. And actually, it would just make a lot of things easier, but the only thing holding it up, but I was talking to the packaging guys, and they're like, we can implement this tomorrow.
Yeah.
It's just an overload of printing.
Yeah.
But it's just the inertia.
Yeah.
Right? But if you had Amazon say, we'll give you a discount if you use that,
Yeah.
it'll happen super fast. You know, they have so much.
Well, it's interesting. What's the role of the post office in this? Because it is very natural that they visit pretty much everybody in America. 6 days, 7. So they should be playing a big role, and I think they are playing some role in Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. We were talking about that. I'm not sure if it's sure. Master General, that kind of, it's arch conservative.
No, I know.
They're trying to, but that's an area that I'm not sure they're really using this way. Amazon is coming in, and Amazon is now, I think, the 3rd largest shipper in the US, after UPS. So they're moving fast. They're really picking up.
Really? Have you seen this system where you can deliver flyers or whatever on postal routes? So you can pick a postal route and say, I want everybody there to get this flyer. Different postal route. I want everybody there to get this different flyer. I want everybody there. So the point is, you can actually do highly customized delivery services basically postal truck by truck.
Really?
Yeah.
So, and they're physical things? These flyers?
Well, or whatever, it doesn't have to be a flyer, it could be some big thing, you say, I want, so you don't have to compile addresses for everybody, you say, everybody on your route gets this in the box.
That makes sense, right? So that
One thing for wealthy people and one thing for non-wealthy.
Or Republicans and Democrats.
Or that, absolutely. They know it, they know the location.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's interesting, I stumbled across it. Privacy.
Oh, because if you wouldn't know the address or something?
Yeah, you don't know the person, you just know the address.
Mm-hmm.
And the address is, it's everywhere, it's a level everywhere else. Property taxes are all, so you know how you get an idea of the part of it. Anyway, I can maybe that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I mean, Google has street maps, right? So we have a really good idea of what's see. It's interesting. Are you much involved with X and what's going on with all those intrinsic and mineral and?
Every now and then I talk to Astro or somebody that's about something having to do with economics. I've done a few tours of the facility and various times.
Okay, all right.
But it's not something on a daily basis.
Because it's interesting that I talked with them. There's actually, I know a lot of people there. There's like home robot division, there's ag division, there's industrial. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, see, I got talking about that, the ag stuff, there's some vertical farming.
Are you talking all about cloud computing?
Not really. I talked to her. Again, they contacted me when they had an issue that, what was it the last time? It was something to do about how would you value that service and price it, so they'll have some new capabilities and stuff about that.
Oh yeah, that looks
So,
good.
yeah, how was I thinking of this? Yeah, anyway, there's a lot of, oh, I know what it was. Have you hired any Googlers on your team?
Well, we
Ex-Googlers. Zoomers, as you call it.
Oh, super. No, not at Ambi, the company?
Yeah, because we set up a venture capital fund specifically targeted towards exclusive users.
Ah, very interesting. Because
I've done some investigating in, basically people have around for a long time and they went on to start a company and it's worked out really quite well.
Oh yeah, that's, well, actually, on the whole venture side, I've been learning a lot because of our own interactions with venture firms. But are you familiar? There's something called Go Capital. That is that you see investment, you have the endowment, and they're a venture capital like arm.
Yeah.
So they invest primarily in locally based spin-outs, and they've been doing it for a while. It's really going up. And I'm glad they're getting smart about this finally because they're smart pension in there.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, so I'm involved with a couple of different venture groups and advising. It's fascinating to see how that works.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting.
Fun business, because it's constantly new things, energy.
Yeah, now, and there are many different views that you just hear what people say, you don't know what they're actually doing or how it actually comes out, but the venture capitalists claim that they'll see a burst of technology, like this, like computational biology now is a very new field, you might imagine. And they don't know who the winner's going to be, but they know who the failures going to be. So I'll have several investment players to some degree.
But they'll know that something's going to hit.
Yeah, they know that something will happen. And in that case, it's pretty much a sure thing, so that's what we're
Well, hey Mike.
Good morning, Dan.
Hal, nice to see you.
Oh, yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you.
We're just talking about venture capital and how
Excellent.
that works. And one area you may have heard of this is tests, these new tests that are now on blood, where they pick up a sample of blood and they look at DNA fragments. And so they make a real test of it, 50 different kinds of cancers, early stage, at one shot.
Yeah, now there's tons of biotech for the next 10 years. It's going to explode. Another one is attaching little bits of radiation to antibodies that are primed to bind to cancer-expressing cells. And so the little antibody goes there, it sits next to the cell, it's got a little bit of reactivity and kills the cell. That's within 10 years could be a thing.
That's like Moderna.
Run a quick
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I can't tell if it's on or not. Is it on back there? Yes. All right.
Okay, I think I'll go ahead and get going. So this is a real pleasure to have a colleague and friend and universal man, Hal Varian, back with us. So Hal's a leading economist and has played a real role in the internet economy at many, many levels, some of which we probably know nothing about. A good chunk of his work has been done at Google, where the ads placement, the auction behind that was developed by Hal. I learned about Hal first when I just met him. I came to campus and he was dean of the iSchool. He had created that idea, I think, and a leading economist. And so I was kind of expecting to meet one of these people who would draw lines that cross on a piece of paper. And instead, no, he was working with some little data set and analyzing it with some little piece of code that he'd written, and was very excited about what the data were saying and all of that. I said, this is an unusual economist. But of course it's not. He was the harbinger of things to come. So very passionate about many, many issues, but particularly looking at data and looking at things. And I think that's exactly what the talk is going to be about. This was something that Hal latched onto early on with the interest, the excitement about seeing all this data in real time flowing, the nowcasting idea. And I think that was maybe 20 years ago when that started. So presumably we're getting both a back look and a nowcasting of where the whole project is. So, very interesting. So I'll say no more. I think all of you know who Hal is, and so if questions come during the event, that's great. Just kind of keep this informal, and we'll go from there. So Hal, nice to have you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So it is a great pleasure to be back at my alma mater. I was a graduate student here, where I got my degrees in economics and mathematics. So I want to talk about nowcasting with Google Trends. And first question, how many people know what Google Trends is? Okay, it's at least half of the audience. So I don't have to go into that in much detail. All right, but I have a second question. What day of the week are there the most searches for a hangover? Okay, how many people think Sunday? Oh, there's the party group right there. We see them. All right, well, how would you find out the answer? You'd go to Google, and you would look at Google Trends, and you could get a measure of what the searches for hangover look like. And there you'll see I also did the searches for vodka. And if you look at that very closely, you'll see that it's a one-day leading indicator. So when there's a lot of searches on vodka, it turns out there tend to be a lot of searches on hangover the next day, and typically the big day is Sunday morning, of course. And what's that big spike? That's New Year's Day, okay? It's New Year's Day. They're just over that New Year's Eve celebration. You can look at geos, so this shows you where the query was particularly popular, and if you look at a little finer granular inspection, you'll see that New York City is the hangover capital of the U.S. And then you'll see the kinds of queries that people are asking. So it's a lot of data about the queries, and it's a lot of fun for anecdotes like this, but we'll see some more serious applications in just a minute. Here's one other example before I go away, there's a gift for boyfriend and gift for girlfriend. And you can see the gift for boyfriend is substantially larger than the gift for girlfriend. And there they are going up, peaking around Christmas time. Then it's another bubble around around Valentine's Day and so on. But look what happens when they get married. Here's gift for wife and gift for husband. So there are those poor guys saying, oh my God, Christmas is tomorrow, what am I going to do? And they run out and try to find a gift for wife. And then you notice it's a little flatter line. Valentine's Day isn't quite what it used to be. So it gives you a little picture of a story, I guess, a story behind these Google queries. And there's some limitations of trends. You only get popular queries. You don't get what we call the long table queries because they have to be a certain number of them from distinct IP addresses. So we're pretty sure that they're common queries. Only aggregate data for privacy reasons, of course. Largest value is 100 and everything's normalized relative to that, so it's a index really. Data is a sample, it changes from day to day, not very much because it's a pretty big sample. It's cached on a daily basis, so if you offer the same query several times, you get the same answer in a given day, but then the next day there'll be slightly different answer, very slightly different. There's a cap on daily downloads, so you can't just harvest this stuff directly, puts a big load on our machines, but there is an API available to qualified researchers, and everybody here is a qualified researcher, so you come up with a good, interesting project, you can use this Trends API, and you can search not just on words, the way I've done it here, but on entities. Okay, so that's from the knowledge graph. There are all these entities and categories, which are more economic in nature. And you can also look at not just Google queries, but images, news, shopping, and YouTube. So it's really a pretty useful system, not very hard to get started in doing it. I should warn you that some queries have a downward bias. So here, for example, is the searches for Civil War. Okay? So why does it have that peculiar behavior? It's got very strong seasonality. And also, of course, it's going down over time. Why is that? Well, it turns out the reason that happens is the people who are searching for Civil War are usually in school somewhere, and maybe they're doing a paper or something of that sort. And so you have this cyclicity that lines up with the academic calendar. And to show you that's what's going on, there's a query on term paper. Okay, so we can see pretty much exactly the same thing, where there's a peak in term paper, there are these troughs, and they align with the calendar. But more importantly, if you go back to 2004, when this series starts, you'll see you'll see that it was primarily, the internet was primarily used in academic institutions. And so any question that's an academic sort of question is a lower fraction of the total searches now than it was back when the internet was young. So sometimes you need to worry about that bias, sometimes you don't. Depends on the nature of the question you're looking at. So John Patel, who's an industry analyst, once said Google's a database of intentions, which is kind of a nice phrase, I think. Because intentions usually precede actions. So if you look at Google and see what intentions look like, that gives you some suggestion of what actions might look like. So most things that people are doing on the internet lead from intention to action very quickly, like you have an impulse purchase, or you decide something or other broke and I've got to go to get a new one, and the intentions, as indicated by the Google searches, have a very close proximity to the actual actions. So that's nowcasting. You're looking at a very high frequency forecasting question. But then some intentions are far in advance of the actions, things like buying a new house. That can take months. And you can look at the activity in queries of various sorts, real estate agent, housing, houses in Lafayette, all sorts of questions of this sort, and you'll get an idea of what the housing market looks like when lots of people are looking at mortgages, all sorts of housing-related terms. Buying a new car, same sort of thing. Vacations, people are planning their vacations around, let's say now, maybe March, and they execute, they take their vacation, so maybe sometime in July or August. So what happens is you can get a pretty good idea of what the tourism situation will look like in August by looking at the queries that are going on in March and April. And lots of tourist boards around the world have caught on to that and are using Google Trends to get this measure of what the load on visitors might be like when people are carrying out their vacations. And so there's a case where you're really predicting months in advance, several months in advance, who's going to see the tourism when they actually take their vacations. So, for example, one of the things we looked at is we looked at the Gulf oil spill. This was maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And you could basically watch people move from the west coast of Florida to the east coast of Florida. When it became clear that this was a very detrimental oil spill, was going to ruin the beaches, people shifted their queries, and you could see what would happen when they actually carried out those tourism trips. Instead of going to the west as planned, they went to the east. Okay, so forecasting, that's predicting the future. Nowcasting, that's predicting the present. And why is it interesting to predict the present? Well, for lots of data, especially economic data, they're released periodically, and of course there's some reporting lag. So GDP, for example, is only reported every quarter, every 3 months, because it just takes a lot of time to compile all that data. And they have pre-releases and then adjusted releases. Many economic time series are released in 3 waves. So I'll have the first preliminary results, then the likely results, and if necessary, a third reporting release. And what's nice about that is if we exploit this database of intentions, you can get a lot of idea about what people's economic activities will look like over the course of the next few weeks, and that may turn out to be predictive of what the monthly data are going to look like when they're aggregated and reported, released to the public. So central banks like the Fed, European Central Bank, Bank of England, they're very, very interested in being able to do this to get a high frequency read on what the economies look like. So especially when we see things like the COVID recession, the Great Recession, and so on, they'd like to have as much advance time as possible so they can adjust their fiscal monetary policy in a way that's going to be in accord with what the economy is actually going through. Okay, so that's the anecdotal stories. Let's talk a little bit about what the statistics look like. So I'm going to talk about something called the basic structural model. And the idea is we can look at these economic statistics as having a time series component. So time series are things like local moving averages, local trends, and seasonality, where you see a pattern in queries that changes over time. And by seasonality, I don't just mean seasons, I mean days of week and things like that of all sorts. And what we do is we build a forecasting system where we have a Kalman filter for that time series component, and then we have a regression component also based on the Google Trends data that helps you estimate a model dealing with anomalous behavior. So the trends and the seasonality are something you see very strongly in most data of an economic sort. And the regression component uses something called spike and slab, which is a way, kind of like a way to estimate the what variables are in your regression. So it's a little bit like lasso, only it's a Bayesian formulation. So it fits in very nicely with the Kalman filter, which is also Bayesian friendly. And this software that I'm describing is created by Steve Scott, who worked on my team. He really did, I think, a brilliant job with this. You can download it from CRAN if you want and play with it to your heart's content. So the basic idea is you have a model for this time series. It's got a trend in it, local trend. It's got seasonality typically, and it's got a regression. Okay. So the trend and seasonality, they're adaptive and non-parametric. If you want to throw in some extra components, that's fine. For example, lots of times there'll be holidays that would be affecting the performance of your model, and you can add them in as additional predictor. It's not just limited to Google Trends. We developed it for that problem, and so it fits that problem very well. But you could do the same sort of thing with Twitter data. You could do the same sort of thing with credit card data, all sorts of different ways that you can find correlates of this economic time series that you're interested in, and you may have both this trend and regression effect going on. So it'll be clear what that means in a minute or two, because I'll give you some answer examples. One very quick word about Kalman filters. This is an engineering school here, so everybody must know what a Kalman filter is. So the idea is there's two big time series models you see all the time. One is a random walk. So yt equals yt plus epsilon t, where epsilon is an error term. Or a constant mean, where you're just seeing something fluctuating around a mean. So yt equals mu, some constant, plus the error term. And a Kalman filter is a way of getting between those two cases. Those are the extreme cases. So over here on the right, there's a mean model where things are fluctuating around around zero in this case. And there's a random walk where things are sort of going off explosively. And what you want to do with a Kalman filter is you want to get an in-between model that allows somewhere between those two extremes. And the way it works in a very simple description is the forecast for tomorrow is whatever you forecast for today plus an adjustment term, and the adjustment is the error that you made today. So the error is feeding back into the estimation process, and you can get a model that evolves over time to fit the data that you're concerned with. And then with this, to get down to details, we use something called a basic structural model, where you've got an observation that depends on some hidden state. You've got a level of the hidden state. You've got a slope, how it behaves, a local, in our case, a local linear slope. And then you have a seasonal component. And that's just a stochastic generalization of what we think of as a constant trend model, where we sort of fix all the parameters. That would be the most naive model for forecasting a time series. Here with the Kalman filter, we can allow those to be stochastic and, as I say, evolve over time to better fit your data as time goes on. And then I mentioned earlier that we had this regression model, and it's not just any old regression with fixed predictors, but it's got a model for choosing those predictors with respect to their estimated probability of inclusion in the regression. So that regression allows you to also be flexible over time, because there could conceivably be different responses to different kinds of interventions in that time series. And then it's all in a Bayesian framework. It's all done by MC sampler. So I'll just skip this slide and go right to the examples. So here is a plot of initial claims for unemployment benefits and the unemployment rate. So let me describe to you what I mean. If you became suddenly unemployed, what would you do? Well, the first thing you might do is go to Google and say, where's the unemployment office? How do I file for unemployment? What papers do I need for unemployment filing? What are the hours you're open? Where's the address? You know, on and on and on, all questions about the unemployment office. And not surprisingly, those are a pretty good predictor of what happens to the initial claims for unemployment benefits, because people are asking these queries of Google to find out about how you apply for unemployment, and then once they get the answers, they follow through, and so we see them in the reported data. And one thing you notice, if you look at this chart, the initial claims are the black line, the unemployment figures are the red line, and then the gray bars are recessions. So one of the things you can see is that if you look at the peaks of that unemployment rate, it's occurring at the end of every excuse me, I said it backwards. Suppose you look at this chart, if you look at the initial claims, they peak right at the end of every recession. And you say, oh, wow, that's fantastic. But the little secret is that economists get to determine when a recession ends, and they look at the initial claims for unemployment as one of the metrics. So it's true that they're highly correlated, but the causality tends to go mostly the other direction. However, it also turns out that the unemployment rate is actually predicted to some degree from the initial claims. You think of a model where you have water running into a sink, so the water running in are people filing for unemployment benefits, and the level of the water in the sink is the unemployment rate as that changes over time. So when the initial claims slow down, you expect to see the unemployment rate settle down a few months later. So there's a couple months leading indicator there. So it's really nice. If you could predict initial claims better from looking at these queries that people are making, that allows you to take action more quickly than if you had to wait till the final figures were in. So if you feed in the initial claims data, so you go to the government statistics pages. You get the initial claims. Then what's it correlated with? Well, just as I said, the queries that are highly correlated with that are things like Michigan unemployment, Idaho unemployment, unemployment filing, New Jersey unemployment, and so on. And the reason all the states are there, these programs are run by the states, so you're collecting it from a state office. So indeed, it is highly predictive, just as I suggested earlier. And we can estimate a model using this Bayesian structural time series, the basic structural model that I referred to earlier. In this case, we want a local trend, and then we want a seasonal component, and then we want to estimate this using as a regression that says we'll also look at these queries, the volume of queries on unemployment office, for example, or a series of issues that have to do with unemployment. And what happens is, in fact, the important search terms are really helpful in describing this process where unemployment office, filing for unemployment, Idaho unemployment, and so on. And there's a kind of a spurious example down here with Sirius Radio that I guess was running a campaign right at the end of or during the Great Recession, so that shows up as a correlate as well, even though we don't think there's any causal connection. So what's nice, if we look for these queries, let's say on unemployment office, then that gives us a pretty good idea of what the initial claims are actually going to look like when they're released by the government. And here's a nice chart on the right. It's the cumulative prediction error. Okay, cumulative absolute one step ahead prediction level. And what happens is you can see that well, you can see, but I can't see. Let me see here. Yeah, if we just do a straight Kalman filter, that's the black line, and we notice the error rate goes up. Guess when? Right when the recession peaks, just as you would expect. So you're getting pretty much the same behavior with the Google Trends and without it when things are just moving along in their standard way, and then along comes the recession, and now your error rate goes up significantly. You get a big bump at that point. So the Google Trends really is helping the model to react to sudden changes, just like the recession or like the Florida oil spill or any of these other anomalous events, because the Kalman filter works really pretty darn well when there's nothing going on, when you're just doing a sort of steady level of growth or decline. But it's when you've got these anomalous events popping in that really your model needs some help, and that's what's going on here. We're using the Google Trends queries on unemployment office, and that helps us reduce the error rate in our forecasting model. And you can, remember I said you could look at these different components. You had the trend, that's just a local linear trend, allowing for some forward-looking smoothing. You've got the seasonal over here on the right. Then you've got the regression, which is saying, hey, something changed, all right? Okay. And so those are the components. You can see the regression is really important. So just using the Kalman filter itself is fine when things are behaving normally, but it's not the normal behavior we're interested in. We're interested in the behavior that's the non-expected or surprise sorts of behaviors. Not a surprise to us so much because we looked at the initial claims, we looked at the data on queries on employment filing, so that helps us predict the actual outcome when it's released by the government. And there's what kind of the final picture looks like. This is within sample, I have to warn you. And you can see the initial claims, non-seasonally adjusted, and the unemployment filing in red, and you can see they line up really quite well. Another example, same sort of thing, so I'll go a little more quickly. Suppose we look at real estate. So these queries that you can look at in Google Trends, as I indicated, you don't just have to use specific query terms, you can use categories of queries. So here, for example, in real estate, there are queries about apartments and residential rentals, there are queries about commercial and investment real estate, and so on and so on. So there's a categorization system that goes on there. And I tried fitting 3 different models. One is where I used all the categories that we had at this level. So this is what's called the second level categories. They get even finer as you move down the tree. 148 commercial categories. The 9 real estate categories, those are the 9 categories that are over on the left part there. And I compared the cumulative one step ahead error rate for those 3 sample sizes. And the takeaway here is that if you look at all, which is the blue line, it's very close to the red line. And then you've got the overall just Kalman filter, which doesn't use any information from Google Trends. We see that has a substantially higher error rate. So it's pretty much what went on before. When we saw the movement, the red and the blue lines are, the red, the real estate line, and the all are very highly correlated. You don't lose much by throwing away those 148 commercial queries and just using the real estate queries. And the Kalman filter, which doesn't use any of the queries, does much worse. All right? So the point is you can do, if you really don't know what good predictors are, then you can use the model to choose them. But most of the cases, it's pretty obvious. If you're interested in housing, you're going to look at real estate queries. Okay? And then here we can do out-of-state. Was there a question back there? No. There was, you could do out-of-state prediction. This is a model where we fix a cut point. We estimate the model to the left of that cut point, and then we just run the model with no further estimation on the right-hand side. So you can see that actually the out-of-sample fit is not bad in this model. Automobiles, same sort of story. In this case, if we run the variable selection spike and slab component of this model, it says, well, the highest, most likely term to be included in the regression is the autos and vehicles vehicle shopping component. Okay, makes perfect sense. But then there are these other sort of messy things like women's health and internet and telecom. Those are not really likely to be very good predictors for obvious reasons. And indeed, if we look over at the chart, Kalman does very poorly. Restricting to just motor vehicle queries is quite helpful in this case. And if we don't know what it's going to take to get the best set of queries, we're not doing badly by taking the auto queries out and just using them rather than use the whole set. And we gave it a very, very challenging problem. This was the Great Recession where the automobile industry almost collapsed. So it's not too surprising that the model finds it hard to fit that collapse. And same thing, out-of-sample prediction looks like that. Okay, so those are some simple motivating examples, but that's just the beginning. There's lots of other neat stuff that you can do with this kind of data and these statistical techniques. One thing you do is you can track GDP. So remember I said earlier that GDP was only reported on a quarterly basis, but you're observing Google Trends on pretty much a continuous basis. You can even go down to day-by-day level, or in some cases hour by hour. But what's nice is you can use that correlation between GDP and the Google Trends data to, in fact, interpolate what GDP would be on a monthly or weekly basis. And this has become very popular these days. There's a couple central banks in, the Richmond Fed and the New York Fed both have tracking models where they're trying to take the official GDP figures and use, in their case, financial variables to try to develop a weekly high-frequency model. So you can look at GDP in a high-frequency terms. And this is one that comes from the OECD. We provided this guy with access to the API, and you could take 20 different countries, 20 countries that the OECD cares about. There's Argentina is number 1 in the alphabet, And so you've got this chart which shows you the actual GDP. I think that's in the red lines, and then it shows you the interpolated values using the Google Trends. And this uses entirely Google Trends for each of these countries to get this way of high-frequency measurement of GDP. So it's pretty neat. I talked about time series up until now, because that's one of the things that macroeconomists work on a lot. But now I want to turn to looking at some cross-sectional examples. And these are somewhere between the anecdotes I started with and the analytics that I was just discussing. So for example, where are the happiest cities in the U.S.? And some economists at Harvard took this data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System survey. So every year people call up, the researchers call up and ask, in general, how satisfied are you with your life? Okay? So that's the survey, and you can look at how that varies with geography of what differentiates the happy and the unhappy cities. So we can run this Bayesian structural time series method I talked before. Just forget about the time series side and just look at the geography. And it turns out the predictors of inclusion and the regression for happy cities are gambling, manufacturing. Those have a negative influence. That is, those are unhappy places when there's a lot of gambling, a lot of marketing. Insurance, that's something that shows up only in areas where there are relatively rich people, because the poor people can't afford insurance, so that's a positive indicator of happy cities. Coupons, discounts, toys, and so on. You can get a picture of what are the characteristics that are correlated with the happiness measure. We have a tool which is a very, very handy. Yeah, sure.
You have mentioned in the past, could you just look at the median income?
There are probably other correlates. I mean, there are definitely other correlates. Income is a big deal. Money can't buy happiness.
You told us the story,
Yeah.
you essentially mentioned income, and now I'm looking at income in all of this.
Right,
So I
right.
wonder whether there is the leap in sort of how much is correlated.
If I wanted to throw in additional predictive, there might be health insurance or all sorts of things that you could use as additional predictors to try to predict what the happy and unhappy cities look like. This is just because the talk is about Google Trends, so Google Trends itself shows that. But you're right, this isn't the end of the story by any means. Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know. I mean, it always happens. So when you get, it's a fairly low probability, but where there are lots of queries about toys, that's a negative indicator of the happiness response. So, Okay, let me tell you a minute about Google Surveys. Google Surveys allows you to conduct a survey where you get results back in a couple days. And how's it work? You create your survey, and this was designed for marketing applications, so it's not perfectly aligned with scientific goals, but it's not. It turns out it's not too bad. People complete the questions in order to access premium content. So you might have seen a page like this. This is a page from Business Week Online, where it says, well, if you want to get to that content, please answer these questions on this short survey. And so they answer the question survey, the door is lifted, they get in and see the content. It's the premium content. So it's a way of rewarding people for participating in the survey. You can do it in real time. And publishers get paid for the clicks on that survey. And you, the survey taker, pay in order to access that service and to get the answers to the questions. So it's very neat. And it works surprisingly well. And I'll show you why I think it works surprisingly well. Because you can take any survey that's professionally designed, look at the results that they get, run the same survey using this Google Surveys tool, and see how well they fit. I mean, see whether they give you the same answer. So the great thing about surveys is anybody can do them. You could go out and do this, do it for $10. You could do several dozen queries. The results come back in a few hours or days at most. You could replicate existing surveys. When I go look at a survey that's reported in the paper, the first thing I do is run it through Google Surveys and see whether I'm getting the same answer. It's a test on both sides. Is surveys giving you the same thing as this professionally designed survey? And then you can also use this as a little pre-run to plan your real survey, is to measure the sensitivity to wording or to framing or other things that you might be concerned about. And here's an example. Pew, which is a very, very high quality survey company or a nonprofit in DC, and they asked people, if you were asked to use one of these commonly used names for social classes, which class would you say you're in? And there's what Google says: middle class, lower middle, upper middle, lower class, and so on. Pew asked the same question, and here's how the Google data and the Pew data align, which I think is really quite impressive. So that in fact you're getting the same results very quickly, very cheaply, as you get from a high-priced, very capable, very careful survey that Pew runs. And we've seen other examples like this. I'll show you a few more. Yeah, this is a good one. I prefer to buy products that are assembled in America. Okay? So you can ask people that. Strongly agree, neutral, and so on. And then we can see what predictors are for people who are strong. Yes, you're beginning to see the picture here. Chevrolet, firearms, country music, and trucks. Those are all predictors of whether you strongly believe in buying in America. And in fact, if you look at the top cities and the bottom cities, well, look on the right, where's Berkeley? Yeah, so you can see there's a dramatic difference in geography, and if you look at how it appears from the viewpoint of the country, you can see this area where people strongly believe in buying America, and then the areas out here on the West Coast where it's not such a strong signal at all.
If you look at whether people actually do that, or then because it's also again correlated with that. So
Right, right.
automatically buy the cheap Chinese products even though they say that they're buying none.
So we don't really have a way to see what they're actually buying, but we could say not just I believe in, but I actually buy. So you can see if there's a question between people saying one thing, I think it's important, the other thing, I'm doing it. And those could be different questions, and you might have some alignment. No, don't have the data.
How do you get like the correlation, like some people answer the survey, but how do you get those correlations that they're searching? Like, is it like some track?
So this was a question about whether people actually behave this way. I'm repeating the question because this is recorded and I want the audience to hear at least the question I heard. You could do this with actual goods because you can look at things like the Nielsen home scan where they look at actual purchases by households. And it would potentially give you that information. But often it's not very easy to tell whether a product is made in America or not. You have to do a little work to see whether that's the case. Here it's really attitudes, and the important point is it's attitudes that are associated with a certain geography. And just as you say, it's a correlation. It's obviously not causal here, but it's a way to see that the interest in buying America is strongly located in certain geographies. Okay. Yes, sir. Oh yeah. So Yeah, the question is, what about selection bias, who reads the article, et cetera, et cetera? Well, it doesn't work for some things. I ask queries, for example, about reading news. You read a newspaper every day, things like that. And I got poor results. Why? Because it's restricted only to people who are looking at stories where they're going to get this pop-up survey. So there's no reason to believe ex ante that this would necessarily be the same as a randomized survey, which is the gold standard, of course. But the surprising thing is that it does as well as it does. So I would say you have to be careful about this use for obvious reasons, selection bias of one sort or another. But in many cases, it seems to give you results that are aligned with more scientific forms. Yeah, so what happens is, in this case, you can break it down by male, female, and by age groups, for example, but obviously you can't break it down too finely because of privacy issues. But it does have certain demographic data, and it's, the surveys are reported for men, women, ages, income levels. Income levels, of course, are associated with where you live, so you can do that kind of thing. Ken?
But on that symbol bias, do you get to pick the type of articles that it really pops up on, and now we say I want news like economists, for example?
Only by selecting the publications. See, you can restrict it to certain publications if you want. And there's another tool. I'm mentioning this one because that's where this data came from. But there's also an app you can get for your mobile phone where you're called upon to answer questions, and you get paid in points you can use to download music and download video. So that's, of course, a very particular audience. It's not a random sample by any means, but it is very useful for that audience because people want to know what the what younger people, for example, are interested in. So you can do these surveys for this selected population of people who download the application, and that's also very helpful for that particular audience. Okay, I'm almost done here. I'm going to say a word about causal inference, since we were talking about that a moment ago. And the simplest way to get at causal inference in this framework comes by going back to the time series example. And what happens here is I estimate a model. I've got a training period where I estimate a model for whatever I'm interested in. Let's say clicks in this particular case, clicks on an ad. So I train it over a period of time, then I test my model, extrapolate to what that looks like if I look at out-of-sample data. And I like it. I say, well, I can do a pretty good job of focusing clicks on that query. And now I'm going to treat. So I'm going to apply the treatment, which might be some new ad, some new creative, some new format, whatever. And then I compare the treatment component, the treatment period, to the forecast that we get from the previously trained model. So obviously this is the simplest way to do a kind of causal inference. There's much more complex ways, and there's ways to deal with lots of difficulties that arrive. But for what we're doing here, it's pretty handy because we can use those Google Trends variables again for predictive variables in this model. So we run a model where we try to predict what happens in the future for this particular problem. We build a forecasting model so we see what will happen, what our model predicts, and then we use a prediction as a counterfactual. So there's the treatment that applies to the actual. We compare that to the estimated counterfactual from the previous two phases. And then the difference between the black lines and the red lines in period 3, that would be our estimate of the causal impact of whatever the treatment was. So pretty handy. And we can do lots of different models that way. We could do it in time series, as I showed you in the previous slide. We can do it cross-sectionally. We take some DMAs, designated marketing areas, some DMAs where they're treated, some where they aren't. We try to predict what the outcomes will be in the absence of a treated model by looking at the first phase. And once we've got that, then we forecast. Then we take the actual and compare that to what our forecast of the counterfactual would be. Okay? So as I say, it's a simple and robust method, and it's one thing we use for measuring the causal impact of various changes to ad campaigns. And I think I'm going to stop there because the rest of it is pretty much variations on the theme we've seen, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience.
All right, are there questions? I'll bring the microphone to you.
Yeah, so one of my questions is, most of the data you showed here is sort of acquired from a sort of like barter economy with your customers, right? You say, oh, we'll provide you with good quality searches if you tell us what you want to search for, or you can have access to this article if you fill out this survey. You briefly mentioned Google Opinion Rewards, where that's not the case, and you're actually assigning some monetary value to that data. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I'm wondering is, like in that setting, you have a much finer control of pricing. Like you have to actually assign some value to this data, whereas with a Google search and with surveys, you don't really have to do that. Is that a very challenging problem to assign value to data like that?
Well, what happens is there are many companies provide you with online behavior of one sort or another. ComScore is one example. Nielsen HomeScan is another example. So with Nielsen HomeScan, what you do is you scan all your receipts for all the products you bring into your house. So you join up with this program, you scan your grocery receipts, your product receipts, everything you buy. And of course, that's a big pain to do all that, as you might expect. So they pay them, and what they pay them is basically in small appliances, toasters and ovens and mixers and all that kind of stuff. That's a typical thing that they use for trading. So there are many different companies that assemble these panels and look at human behavior related to various kinds of marketing decisions. So this is a step in that direction. You could also draw on the other providers of consumer level data if you want. Up to you, whatever works best.
So, Jan, why don't you wait for Mike?
Thank you. So I'm imagining that this could be useful, especially when you notice something go out of distribution, because you could set a trigger. Essentially, there's something happening here that we didn't predict. Mm-hmm. And that seems very interesting. I'm just curious, has that been? Are there tools? Can you set such triggers? And I'm also curious about have you studied this in the context of Google Scholar?
Yeah. So yes, indeed, it's called anomaly detection. You have some time series or maybe cross section. We have an idea of what the normal or expected behavior is, and then we look for stuff that's k standard deviations away from the normal, where k is chosen by you. Be whatever you want. And this is very nicely suited to that because we get these nice estimated confidence intervals from the Bayesian regression, and it helps interpret what these anomalies might look like. So for example, when you run these sorts of models, if you're not very experienced in it, you tend to forget about holidays. So holidays show up all the time, especially when you're looking at other countries. There are holidays you've never heard of, and so you find these anomalies, and that's good because you say, okay, there's a reason for that anomaly, namely all the stores are closed or whatever. So you can refine your model, and one of the things we maintain is this massive list of holidays around the world, so we can separate those out as known anomalies and ignore them in terms of our search for whether there's something really bad happening. And that could be, hardware failures, software failures, disturbances of one sort or another, etc. But we do that all the time. That's one of the common uses of this technology.
I was particularly interested in the causal aspect of this, and I'm sure that as time goes on, more causal people will get engaged with this. In particular, spike and slab is, certainly a quite reasonable way to get some coefficients to go to 0. But looking at your results, as I'm sure you do, there's all this stuff down there, and you say, well, it's obvious, and it's because it's kind of causally obvious to you. But it seems like there's lots of opportunity for causal feature selection as well as causal predictions. If you do a counterfactual, if I were to turn this feature on counterfactually, what would happen? And then, if that doesn't seem to have an effect, that's an evidence that feature is actually not a causal one, and so drop it from the model.
So
I just wonder how thoroughgoing the causal story can be here. And also just maybe add that one of the hopes in causal inference is if you have really, really large data sets, you can do matching much more easily. Just by chance alone, there's two things which are really close, and one of them got the treatment, one of them got the control. You can subtract, and so on and so forth. So I just wondered how far the causal part of this is going.
So that's a great question, and that's exactly what we would like to do. We're not there yet, but it's something that we have tried to move towards. And there are lots of things where you can do. Take the time series example. You may have some experiment. You turn it on for a while, you turn it off, you turn it on, you turn it off. After doing that a few times, you say, wow, this sure looks like it's as causal as a light switch. That's a pretty high standard. And that's something when you have a lot of data, you can do that. And we certainly do exactly that kind of behavior.
Any other questions? Two. Serena, you're closer to me.
And one thing while we're waiting there, this big data, it's a bit of a curse too, because as you have larger and larger data sets, you get more and more cases where there are spurious results, like the example where somebody just happens to be a news event in the same week that you're doing the experiment. One time we did an experiment, we got fantastic results, incredible results, and we said, well, what's going on here? And it turns out there was a tornado that knocked down the stores right in the place where we're doing our experiment focus. So you have to be careful, because more and more variables you have, the more and more spurious variables creep into your fits. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. So you had alluded to earlier with the academic trends that the user base over time had changed. So previously, people were looking up term paper a lot more, and that was decreasing. I was wondering, have you found any trends there in the changes in the user base over time in other aspects, say demographically, income, and how might that have? How are you factoring that into how you're analyzing these trends from the results that you see?
Yeah. So when mobile devices came along, they had a lot of different impacts on what the aggregate data looked like. For example, prior to the mobile phones, there was a very strong weather effect. When you had bad weather for a few days, and then you had some really nice days, the queries dropped off. Why? Because people went outside and smelled the flowers and took a walk and did all those things that were driven by this change in the weather. Well, now, of course, you carry your mobile phone with you. So there's still an effect for the weather, but it's just not as strong as it used to be, because you can still do queries even when it is a nice day outside. So that's another thing that happens. And a third thing is what we call distractions. When there's a big event, a newsworthy event like the war, for example, or volcano eruption or a big earthquake, there'll be commercial queries drop off because people are really interested in what's going on with these various events. So we learn to expect that as well. So when you work with this data, which for several decades, 2 decades now, which we have done, you'll find a lot of standard gotchas that you try to filter out of your actual estimation.
So this is more of a practical question, but I imagine that there are a lot of companies that are ingesting the data that you produce and then creating a lot of value out in the world by providing analytics or nowcasting or forecasting for other people. And I'm wondering, actually, just what do the most interesting companies that do this look like, you know, in your estimation, and then what would the next generation of such companies be? What's like the next step in providing value to, you know, real people that are not registered academic users that access your API? You know, how does this touch their lives 10 years from now?
Well, the companies that naturally spring to mind are financial companies, right? Because
Like
they're
funds.
very interested in forecasting the future if they could do it ahead of everybody else. But most of the things we've seen, the causality runs the other direction. The financial markets can respond to changes in the supply of oil within fractions of a second, and even the Google queries are not that fast. So it's really the changes in the price of oil that are impacting the queries, not the queries that are predictive of the price of oil. So we've seen that for most sorts of financial data. Those just move very, very rapidly these days, even more rapidly than Google.
All right, that's maybe closure at that point. Thanks. Predicting shocks is really the hard part. And this is the real advance here. As a time series person, we're used to predicting smooth things well, and we always have those damn shocks which ruin everything. And this is, I think that's the revolutionary aspect of this, in my view. And making that into real statistics that are reliable is really the future. So thanks. That was wonderful and eye-opening. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.